Hi, everyone. We've set up this Being an Engineer podcast as an industry knowledge repository, if you will. We hope it'll be a tool where engineers can learn about and connect with other companies, technologies, people, resources, and opportunities. So make some connections and enjoy the show.
I've always felt I had kind of a different gear sometimes in terms of drive, and you can have all the talent, you can have all the education, but the application of that is something that really sets people apart.
Hello and welcome to the Being an Engineer podcast. Today we're speaking with Matt Zachek, who holds a bachelor's degree and PhD in biomedical engineering and is currently the Sr Director of R&D at Werfen, leaders in specialized diagnostics in the areas of hemostasis, acute care diagnostics, transfusion, autoimmunity, and transplant. Skilled in product road mapping, stakeholder management, and product delivery in the medical device, pharmaceutical, and diagnostic device spaces, Matt is a strategic thinker with a passion for bringing new ideas to life and a talent for fostering a culture of collaboration and creativity. Matt, thanks so much for joining me on the show today.
Hey, thanks, Aaron, for having me on.
Well, can we start by telling us all how you decided to become an engineer?
Sure. Great question. I'm sure everyone has their own matriculation story as to how they ended up in the engineering field. But for me, it really started when I was a kid. Much to my parents' frustration, I was always taking apart things in the house, not always putting them back together the right way, but I had a passion for understanding how things work. And then from a medical perspective, my entire family is in the medical field. So really being in and around that technology and understanding from a patient perspective how to improve the outcomes there, as well as seeing how that directly affected patients, was really the reason I really wanted to get into the medical field as well. So was always drawn to that. So formulated my educational background around that as well, and haven't looked back since.
Terrific. Thinking back to when you were a kid, can you remember what was one of the most fun things that you took apart and hopefully put back together?
Yeah, no, it's a funny one. I this may be dating myself a little bit, but I couldn't for the life of me figure out how the VCR used to work.
Nice.
So I can recall, thinking of the tape. How did the tape get on the screen? Taking apart, looking at it, seeing how the magnetic strips would be read and how that would be processed. I clearly didn't understand all that as a kid, but wanted to understand how all the different electronics to gears, et cetera, really drove, the mechanical aspects of taking the tape in and pulling it apart and reading it, and how that ultimately ended up on the screen. It was just something I can remember taking apart, but I don't think that one got back together quite in the same way. So
I was going to ask if it worked.
That's
afterwards.
Why it's probably memorable.
Well, that's awesome. That is a true engineer mentality right there, right? Curiosity, mechanical aptitude. Love it. That's a great story. All right. Well, you are a leader right now in the medical device engineering space, and I'm sure there are people out there listening thinking to themselves, I would like to be in that type of role someday. And wondering, how did Matt get there? What are some things, the most influential factors you can think of that allowed you to climb to this position? Yeah,
another great question. I think it starts first with just having strong technical foundations. As I mentioned, really pursued that purpose that I ultimately had in school, where I really wanted to understand where was my core foundation at? And for me, that ended up being more of a mechanical focus, as well as ultimately biosensors as well. And that allowed me to really have something to always go back to whenever I was faced with a challenge or problem. I could have some core discipline that I can extract a way of solving a problem from. But I think also technically, and something that you get a little bit in the biomedical engineering space, is a breadth of disciplines that ultimately allow you to solve the problem at hand. So I was able to not only do that from my educational background, but as I got into industry, really had a lot of different types of experiences that allowed me to really get that breadth and really not just personally, but lead teams through solving problems in elegant ways that didn't rely too much on one particular discipline. And I think through those different opportunities, it's really that foundation really opens up more doors to allow me to be ready when new opportunities came in. I, for example, even spent at one point 6 or 8 months doing a sales role. I was leading a technical problem that ended up where a different technical solution that was more customer facing ended up being something that was more desirable to the company, and took a pivot to be able to do that. But had I not had the breadth of technical foundation to say, I can think about how to download data from customers, parse it, and use it and report it back in a way that is interpretable to them, wouldn't have been ready for that role to take that different track, which ultimately helps, because I think the second piece with any R&D leadership position is really understanding what I'll call the business of R&D, where you have to really understand how are you optimizing your investments in a portfolio. What is the outcome of every initiative that you're doing, so that you can maximize the return on investment for your company, yourself, and your department as well, in terms of investing in skills. So I think that's more on the technical sort of skill set side. I've always felt I had kind of a different gear sometimes in terms of drive, and I'll use maybe an overused term for now, but grit and perseverance. But I think it's really something that truly, you can have all the talent, you can have all the education, but the application of that, is something that really sets people apart. It's the Michael Jordans, Kobe Bryants of the world, waking up at 4 a.m. and getting in the gym before everybody else to really put in your 10,000 hours is, especially in the beginning of a career, is extremely important. To be able to put in that time and be able, from a grit standpoint, to overcome obstacles as they're coming up, was something I tell the team, if it was easy, it'd be done already. So being able to possess that and have that North Star that you want to drive towards and continue to break barriers and push boundaries to get there is really something that I think it embodies how I've been able to get to my position.
That's terrific. I love that you spend some time in sales. I think that's a life skill that, everyone should spend some time learning sales. It's so important.
Yeah, and it's often something that I would think that engineers may shy away from. I think it is, though, really important to have empathy for whatever customer you're trying to solve for, and create solutions for. It's not to say that engineers can't do it. In fact, I think, a lot of times customers, particularly in the medical space, really appreciate seeing engineers that are trying to solve their problems and are really willing to work with you to reach a mutual beneficial solution.
Yeah, for sure. Going back to the grit and perseverance, were there any habits or routines or rituals that you had over the years to develop that grit and perseverance?
It's a good question. I think developing I don't want to call it a robotic methodology, but I think we all are creatures of habit to a certain degree. I have my very specific morning routine. I get up, we'll exercise, get a little sunlight in if it's that time of year. Get to work roughly around the same time, kind of get into my morning routine. And I think just having that discipline kind of takes out the mental bandwidth of how you what decisions you have to make, because that routine is already part of your DNA, and that allows you to expend that mental bandwidth on things that may be more job critical. So it may be a boring answer, but it definitely has helped me in terms of getting disciplined and really ensure that I can focus on overcoming those obstacles from a grit standpoint.
No, I'm the same way. I have my routine, and I do not enjoy departing from it. Do you listen to the Huberman Lab podcast ever?
It's just interesting that you brought that up. I've started to get that into my morning routine and starting to use that to a certain degree. I tried the cold shower thing for a little bit, but
no, I haven't done that myself more than once or twice. But you mentioned the sunlight thing. Andrew Huberman, he talks about the sunlight all the time. That's like his go-to thing.
Yeah, it's from that perspective, my dad's a sleep medicine doctor, so circadian rhythm, understanding how you can reset your biological clock has always been something that's been preached around the home. So there is some truth to that, and I'm sure everybody who's been able to kind of experience that in the morning and throughout the day, it's really helpful to get your 7-8 hours in the night.
Terrific. All right. Well, as you've kind of climbed the ladder, so to speak, moved into more leadership positions, have you ever felt a sense of imposter syndrome, or has it always been, no, I got this, 100% confident in my ability to get the job done?
Yeah. And I know that's another interesting topic that gets floated around, particularly as of late. And I hope it doesn't sound like I'm an egomaniac if I say no, but I think in general, in a leadership role in your organization, having anxiety is just means that you care about your job. It means that anxiety will always be present. But in terms of feeling like I don't deserve a role, or I don't feel like I'm able to perform, I haven't had that, and there's probably a few reasons why. I think from an early stage when I got into the industry, and even I spent a little bit of time in a startup in Germany with a pretty small company, seeing senior leaders and having personal conversations with them. It really lets you know that nobody knows everything. I was a little frustrated by that, to be honest, early in my career, is saying, these senior leaders, they have high level positions. They should know all the answers to everything. And you talk to people, and people are human. They don't know everything. And it's good to know that even at senior levels that there's still going to be ambiguity. There's still going to be things that you have to figure out. And knowing that that's part of the job is okay. And I think that lowers the anxiety level about, particularly with engineers who want to feel like there's a right answer, that there's perfection to be sought in every level. It's good to know that, when you're in and around good leadership, that it's really about, can you manage that ambiguity in front of you? Are you able to lead teams through those things to get to the end goal, rather than to have all the right answers? I think lowers that the imposter anxiety, because they're seeking perfection in terms of a perfect problem solve solution or product or organizational structure. Perfect doesn't really exist, and managing how to optimize that situation and managing teams through that is, I think, the hallmark of getting to good leadership, but without having to feel like you have all the answers.
Yeah, that's a really healthy way to think about it. I'm going to share something tangentially here. I felt maybe a little bit of imposter syndrome from time to time during my career. I don't think it's been a big thing or like debilitating to that level, but I felt it here and there. More than that, though, what I have experienced is stress. I feel stress. I think that's one of that's my big challenge, is managing stress. And recently I had this epiphany that maybe everyone else knows this already, and I'm just late to the party. That could very well be. But the epiphany I had was that, for me anyway, having a positive attitude is not necessarily the right way to get through stress, right? People tell you, well, just think positively. And don't get me wrong, I think it's important to be positive. It's certainly a lot better to be positive than to have a negative attitude, for sure. But personally, I have always felt like having a positive attitude was almost fake in a way, right? It wasn't action-oriented, and it was almost like I was telling myself a lie. And so the epiphany I had is that instead of having a positive attitude, for me anyway, and I think this is true for most action-oriented people, it's more important to have a productive attitude. To when you start to feel that stress, think to yourself, okay, this is not just an emotion that I need to allow to dwell in my body and my mind and feel, anxiety and negative emotions about this is an indication to me that there's a problem and some action needs to be taken. And I just need to figure out what that action is and take the action. It's just a notification system. That's what stress is. So anyway, lately I've been thinking about that. And instead of just having a positive attitude, I think to myself, okay, here's an opportunity to have a productive attitude.
It's a great insight, because I find that not only do people have anxiety, organizations have anxiety as well. And the same philosophy can apply to an organization where, in the absence of a plan, people will act, and they act in a cloud-like fashion, and it really can spiral and create more anxiety, because as people go off on their tangents, they find new things and they all are pulling in different directions. But as soon as someone's able to pull that together, create an action plan to say, this is how we lower the ambiguity in that, the anxiety level, not just people individually, but as an organization, decreases, and they say, yes, okay, I understand how we're going to get from point A to point B, and I can manage the large chunks by breaking it up into very small, manageable bites that we can achieve. And I think once people do see that, like I said, the stress level it doesn't always go away, because sometimes that plan can be very aggressive. But at least from a ambiguity perspective, it can really lower the anxiety.
I had not thought about that from an organizational standpoint. So I love that you brought that up. That's a really interesting way to think about it as well. And I think you're right about that. Let's talk about trends in medical device manufacturing. What kind of trends are you seeing these days, whether it's some type of new process or cost of materials or anything else that comes to mind? But what kind of trends are you seeing in medical device manufacturing?
Yeah, from a manufacturing standpoint, and I'm in R&D, so I'll bias a little bit towards how it plays into overall product development. But in terms of manufacturing, I think the continued evolution of robotics and 3D printing for some industries, it really opens up design freedom. I saw a presentation not too long ago with 3D metal printing and how that affords the engineers a little bit more design flexibility, because of you're not hampered by, let's say, traditional process and tools in that way. And ultimately, that's always with the eye towards what outcome can be improved by that. I think from a product development process standpoint, another trend that I see, and it may not be new for many industries, but in the medical device industry, which sometimes can lag behind in terms of process, getting manufacturing personnel engaged much earlier in the design process to avoid iterations and inefficiency and complexity as you try to develop manufacturing processes for the design that's developed. Getting those folks in much earlier and doing design for manufacturability assessments and really driving that in an earlier stage can really help accelerate projects and goals. I find that the old throw it over the wall that not only is not effective from a project perspective, but can really heighten tension between groups and create a culture of people feeling like there's not a good understanding or empathy for what they do on both sides of that. So having the team all integrated from an early stage, marching towards a single objective with the overall, let's say, key business objectives or customer in mind, can really help from a overall design perspective and project cost standpoint as well.
Yeah, definitely. Getting all those stakeholders involved early on. That's great. Thinking about the engineering teams and the individual engineers that you've worked with to date, what are some of the traits or behaviors or habits that you see in the most successful engineers or engineering teams?
Yeah, great question. I think from an engineering standpoint, I think I mentioned before that I had a really good foundational experience, and I think within every technical discipline, that's something that I really appreciate is an engineer's ability to take a problem or a device performance or a needed customer delighter and really break it down, not just conceptually, but into the specific first principles of engineering to really understand deeply how to affect the performance or solve the problem. I think really being able to derive it in terms of the actual engineering is something I really look for folks that can get from, I understand that this may solve the problem too. I actually have empirically derived exactly the specific lever to pull in order to affect that device. And I think being able to dive really deep in that way, and also from an engineering perspective, be able to communicate it to the relevant folks that can take action on it, back to the action plan, is something that I think is really impactful. The faster and more efficient that communication can happen, the more efficient the organization can become as well. But it really starts with that core technical foundation, depending on each discipline that's whether that's software engineering or whether it's electrical, mechanical. It really being able to kind of dive deep, assess it at that empirical level, and come back up and be able to communicate is something I really value.
Terrific. Yeah. Beyond the technical skills, any non-technical skills that come to mind? I mean, you talked a little bit already about communicating it in a way that makes sense to others. Anything else beyond that?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, the recognition that, and we talked a little bit about it as well, that there isn't a right answer. There's not a right way to do things. Being open to different disciplines and the approaches to doing that is something that I find the best engineers, they're able to beg, borrow, and steal from the different areas that may not be in their core. But having still the ability to take it into the engineering speak, the technical terms, to be able to really get at the specifics, I think is really important. But utilizing that breadth and being willing to go into those different disciplines is really important. And you mentioned team as well. I think it is a little bit different than the individual in terms of what makes a successful team. I think from an engineering perspective in the medical device space, it's a little different than in some other fields where, let's say you're in a consumer electronics space, where you yourself are a user of the things that you are building for or solving a problem for. You innately understand the use cases associated with that. In the medical space, that may not always be the case, where you have something that you're designing for that may be used by one person or purchased by somebody completely different, used by a person, and then having that be used on a person that's completely different. Having empathy for that and really understanding truly what the product has to do, both from a use perspective, but also how it will be purchased, distributed, etc., creates, I think, a different level for teams to really get engaged and make them successful. Because I've seen great products not go places because of some of those other aspects that weren't associated with the end use of the product.
I really like everything you just said there. I'd like to comment on a couple of those points. One, you talked about there's never just one answer, right? Typically, there are a variety of ways that a problem can be solved. We have I don't know, 9 or 10 something principles that are hanging on the wall at Pipeline. And one of them is the absolute certainty principle, which states that be careful about being absolutely certain that you have found, quote unquote, the answer, right? Because you start to think that, okay, I've got the answer. This is it. This is the only way to do it. And it becomes to the exclusion of other potentially better solutions. So there's a balance, right? Because you can't keep continuously over and over looking for a better answer and a better answer and a better answer. At some point, you're going to have something that's good enough and just, done is better than perfect. But I think it's an important balance to keep in mind, the absolute certainty principle. And then the other thing, you mentioned empathy. And this was a few years ago that I heard this, but I thought it was so interesting, and I've remembered it ever since. A coach that I used to work with showed me a video in which the speaker talked about empathy and said that empathy rarely begins with at least. So, for example, Matt, if you said to me, "Oh, I broke my arm yesterday," and I said, "Well, at least you didn't break both of your arms." You still broke your arm, right? Like, that's not me showing empathy. And I just thought it was a really interesting way to think about it, especially so specific with those two words. Engineers, we love specificity, right? Empathy rarely begins with at least.
Yeah, that's a great comment. And having that deep feeling as to what is ultimately necessary to get the job done can lead to even improved solutions. I think I've actually seen multiple times where getting into the in situ with the devices, you find things that, to use your certainty principle, your perfect solution didn't perfectly take into account, and I think the more you can iterate early and often in that environment, the better off, your design, your device will.
Absolutely. Well, let me take a very short break here and share with the listeners that our company, Pipeline Design and Engineering, develops new and innovative manufacturing processes for complex products, then implements them into manual fixtures or fully automated machines to dramatically reduce production costs and improve production yields for OEMs. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Matt Zachek. Matt, what are a few of your biggest challenges as an engineering leader?
Yeah, it's another good one. From a engineering leader, I think a lot of people can likely empathize with the need to be ambidextrous within an engineering role. And what I mean by that is, how do you support all of the current products that are currently on the market while simultaneously developing new and unique and difficult things that ultimately delight your customers even further. And I think it could be very easy, and a lot of people can fall into the trap of saying, "I'm going to support everything that brings in sales today," and it's a good thing to do. But figuring out how to balance that within a constrained environment. Maybe everybody has constraints, whether it's a fixed number of people, fixed budget, whatever, that figuring out how to balance that in a way that can support your current growth, but look for new areas as well is something that I think every engineering leader can empathize with.
Are there any strategies that you've come across or developed in being able to define where that line is between sustaining existing products, but also developing new R&D efforts?
Yeah, I think first, understanding just like your personal investment portfolio, you wouldn't, maybe you would put everything in crypto and let it ride, or other, let's say more traditionally risky investments, right? You'd want to strike that balance. And, I'm looking at data from the industry, and I think the golden ratio typically is what they'd say, 70-10-10-10, right? So 70% would be kind of in your core. 10% would be maybe where you have existing technical competency, but in a new market. 10% would be where you have same market, but maybe a new technical competency. And then 10 would be your moonshot. And I think, not to say that every company and every industry needs to adhere to that, but I find that to be a good balancing rule of separating your technical competencies and the markets you serve, and understanding the balance in your portfolio.
Yeah. How about for medical device companies in general these days? What are some of the challenges that the companies are seeing, not just the individual leaders?
Yeah, great insight there, because I think in the medical device industry, I read a book not too long ago. I think it's called The Innovator's Method, and they rated medical equipment manufacturing as the number one most ambiguous and complicated industry. And there's a variety of reasons why. Not only do you have technical complexity, you have the regulatory complexity, you have a lot of different things that hit you, right? And I think that's very true in terms of medical devices as well. You have ever-changing regulatory landscape. 5-6 years ago, now Europe completely changed the way that they accept medical devices, became more like the FDA. And that came with it a kind of a shift in the industry, right? You had to kind of adapt to that. A lot of strategies changed to accommodate that, and so that's ever changing. I think as a function of devices getting more integrated and let's say software centric as well. You have a whole cybersecurity really industry that's spun up to support and make sure that the things that are really safe, that are safe and effective, still stayed safe and effective from that perspective, and being able to ramp up and support that complexity is really important. Another thing, we touched on manufacturing earlier. I mean, through the pandemic, I think a lot of folks felt that obtaining a raw material supply continuity was also something to continue to think about. It was, I know, a big theme, but even before the pandemic, but it kind of drove a focus on that and ensuring that you maintain that supply continuity throughout the device's lifespan is continuously something that is brought up and weighs on development teams as well. So I'd say just that amount of complexity that continues to evolve is something that, from a medical device perspective, it's one of the biggest challenges that we face.
Yeah, I've heard that same thought echoed by quite a few medical device leaders, just the degree to which the FDA is enforcing different regulations on medical device manufacturers is really a challenging and complicated field to navigate. Thinking about the teams that you work with and have worked with in the past, can you think of a tool that doesn't exist, but if it did, would allow your teams to be dramatically more productive, 10 times more effective than they are today? And it doesn't need to be something within the realms of known physics, right? I've heard teleportation was an answer that someone gave, which I thought was a great one. But I've also heard much simpler answers like a community for engineers, But what thoughts do you have about that? What tool do you wish existed that doesn't?
Oh yeah, if you're opening up to superpowers,
go crazy.
If I can fly or teleport, that would be. I'll probably fall somewhere in the middle. I recently saw I don't know if you saw this, but the recent Google Gemini release for AI. It's a big eye opener for me. I mean, specifically, there was a segment where it highlighted how Gemini could take a research paper that was generated, I think, 3 or 4 years ago. And over a lunch break, it extracted relevant data from over 200,000 papers that then it used to really impressively, to me, take the figures in the graph and expand upon that to now incorporate the recent data from 200,000 new papers, all in the course of, like I said, a quick lunch break. That probably would have taken 3 or 4 months for a scientist or engineer to do. And you can imagine that's one application, but you can imagine how that could be applied to so many different disciplines within engineering. I mean, I think one example, even in the mechanical space, is just understanding once you have the relationship built between your device performance and the various features associated with that, having artificial intelligence iterate all the different solid models that could possibly fill that space would be something, and that does exist today, but could be really enhanced with the use of more powerful artificial intelligence. Thinking about how it could impact everything from the design process, even the test automation and documentation associated with that can help with the complexity we just talked about too. So I think engineers that are able to really harness those tools can really multifold, can really expand their impact multifold. I'd say similar to probably when computers were first introduced. I think in that same vein.
Yeah, AI is incredible. Just amazing what is happening these days. I'm sure you do as well, but I use ChatGPT pretty much every day,
Yeah.
If you had no limitations on time, resources, money, what is the one thing that you would do for your company that would have the most significant impact on achieving its business goals?
Yeah, it's funny that you phrase it that way. I mean, I like to tell the team we can do anything with time, people, and money. Thinking of kind of the golden triangle of project management, right? But I talked a little bit about that ambidexterity earlier of how to manage everything in a portfolio. And, I think if there were no limitations in that way, I'd probably be able to support everything 100%, right? And, and I think, you'd be able to enable all the on-market support with all the moonshots that you could take out, right?
Yeah.
So I think that would be, where the constraintless, problem that would be a good application for it. But, I think, that figuring out a way to expand the impact through new projects as well as supporting current would be the best use of that.
Yeah, instead of 70, 10, 10, 10, 100, 100, 100, 100.
Yeah.
That would be a lot of fun. All we need is unlimited resources. Yeah.
Right.
Come on, AI, help us get there.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, how do you see the future of medical devices in the U.S. changing over the next, say, 5 years?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I mentioned the AI piece. I think that you'll see a little bit of that, not just focused internally, but also externally as well. I can see how that would get into helping clinicians make better decisions. And I think a lot of the mental bandwidth in the medical field is residing within medical training and with doctors, clinicians, and I think you'll see a little bit more assistance in the future in that way. Another trend that I can see is the further integration of consumer electronics with medical devices. It's something that has existed in different spaces. I mean, I don't know if you're wearing your Apple Watch right now, but there's a few things in there that would be formally classified as medical devices that have really made its way into the consumer space. I can see a continued evolution along that. If you think about things like Apple recently announcing that they were working on a continuous glucose monitor within their watch. It'll be very interesting to see from a regulation perspective how the FDA and other regulatory bodies globally will start to manage things in that way where you wouldn't necessarily have to hold it to the same degree of scrutiny, but they may want to for foreseeable misuse purposes. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes.
Yeah, I can't wait for that. All of the different biometric sensors that are being incorporated into consumer products and wearables and clothing even. Very interesting. One of the things that I have found running my own business in terms of developing new strategies and insight into the future and how we should prepare for it is finding different ways to expose myself to new ideas that I may not come up with on my own. And this has been through a wide array of different mediums such as books, podcasts, attending lectures or trade shows, all those kinds of things. What have you done to expose yourself to new ideas? What are the avenues that you like for those kinds of sources?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the things that you mentioned, I mean, there's a lot of different types of media that you can consume. I think personally, beyond that, I mean, trade shows are another good way of seeing what's out there. But I also mentioned, I really don't think that there's a substitute for kind of being in the practice that you intend to serve or in the population and the environment. Right? Being in situ, understanding what problems people are facing, really, from an ethnographic perspective, can really give you that understanding of how best to solve that problem. It's kind of, if you're purely consuming the data that's coming back, you may trick yourself into a faster horse scenario. The old, if I asked customers what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse, and Henry Ford gave him a car. I don't know if that was actually attributed to him correctly, but that's kind of the danger in purely relying on one form. But I really don't think there's a substitute for being embedded and really understanding deeply the needs of the people you intend to serve.
Yeah, terrific. Well, Matt, last question for you, specifically within the context of your role as an engineer. What is one thing that frustrates you, and conversely, one thing that brings you joy?
Okay. Over the course of my career, I don't think there's a better feeling for when you launch a new product, and you really feel like it hits the mark, and you are able to see the people that it serves being delighted and excited about the product. I've been fortunate enough to experience that a number of times in my career, and something I desperately want to have everyone on my team experience on a routine basis if possible. So, I think getting to those endpoints where sometimes it's years of blood, sweat, and tears to get into it, is really an enjoyable thing. Being able to create the high performing teams to do that too is also something that for me is extremely fulfilling, whether that be training opportunities or putting people in the right positions to be successful, setting up the organizations in the right way to do that, or teams, is something that, like I said, for me, it's really fulfilling. From a frustration standpoint, I think the only thing that I could say is, if organizations don't, let's say, have a really strong strategic North Star conviction about where they want to head, and that if there's not an all-in mentality, let's say, within the senior leadership of the company, they can really create a cultural barrier and a divide between different groups, whether that be within engineering groups or cross-functionally. I think, leaders, senior leaders like myself, I just need to be mindful about how do we hold tension at the top, and whether that be we have really constructive conversations, or we disagree and commit, or whatever the tactic would be, that happens, and hold that tension there, and then presenting as a united front would be something that would be a frustration. So it's like I said, not something I'm currently experiencing, but I can see where that would be a challenge.
Yeah, well, thank goodness. That's good to hear. All right, Matt. Well, thank you so much for being on the show today. It's been great getting to know you and hearing some about your experiences and insights into the industry and about engineering. Before we head out, is there anything else that you think we should talk about that we haven't hit on yet?
No, I think we covered it. Thanks.
Okay, awesome. Well, Matt, how can people find you?
Yeah, I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, so it's probably the best place to get in contact.
Excellent. All right. Well, Matt, thank you so much again.
All right, thanks, Aaron.
I'm Aaron Monker, founder of Pipeline Design and Engineering. If you liked what you heard today, please share the episode. To learn how your team can leverage our team's expertise developing turnkey equipment, custom fixtures, and automated machines, and with product design, visit us at teampipeline.us. Thanks for listening.